Welcome back to the next webinar organized by Princeton University's Bendheim Center for Finance. We were happy to have Dani Rodrik with us from the Howard Kennedy School. Hi, Dani. And I would like to give some introductory remarks first. And as usual, let me go back what we have seen so far and what we will go on further on. Last Friday, Michael Kramer was talking about vaccine development, and it was a very interesting talk, why we should develop 15 vaccines simultaneously and how we should streamline and incentivize the process of vaccine development as a cooperation between governments and private firms. Then I would also like to come back to Penny Goldberg's presentation on global value chains, which is connected to today's globalization debate, and perhaps we come back to this as well. And would like to
Markus,
mention that Daron Asimoglu
can I just interrupt for 1 second
on the benefits of targeted policies.
We actually don't see you. Is there a way you can turn your video on?
I think if I do that, I probably lose the slides.
Okay, okay.
I think for you it will work, but something is different today. Zoom changed the setting. Thanks. So let me just do without, nobody can see me today, but you can hear me hopefully. And so on Friday, Daron Asimoglu will talk. And then next week we have Jeremy Stein talking about the Fed policies. And then on Friday, Paul Krugman. So let me talk to today's about globalization. I want to go and start with a bigger picture. And then Dani will actually, will talk the much bigger picture. But let me first talk about the world order. There are two ways you can see the world order we live in. You can have a rule-based, institution-based world order, or a more outcome-based world order. The latter has the advantage that it is more flexibility. A large country can just push through its own interest more flexibly and react to circumstances. But the former, the rule-based world order, has much more predictability, especially in a world where things become more and more complex. The rule-based order also has some limited reactions to shocks. So you can only react to a particular way. You can't just react in any way you would like to react. And is therefore a little bit more symmetric. So the outcome-based is less symmetric because a large country can push through certain interests on its own. Then the third difference is that, in a rule-based order, if there's an adverse feedback loop or a negative feedback loop, there might be trade wars or currency wars. The rules prevent such feedback loops. And this gives the whole system, if it's based on rules, a more stability, while an outcome-based world order is less stable because nobody controls these feedback loops. Now, what are the institutions and the rules? The global institutions, you have the United Nations, WTO, IMF, World Bank, WHO, and so forth. And of course, you have a lot of regional blocks as well. Now, the world order, if it's rule-based, you might say it might be a disadvantage for large countries, but it's not necessarily the case because the large countries can actually better push through certain rules. They can shape the rules, and they can also control the internal politics. So there might be some forces to push for national champions and other things, which might, some favoritism at home. So having international rules might also discipline the behavior at home. So that's an advantage. But the big advantage is, of course, for large countries, they have more influence to shape the global rules. And that's also why we see more and more blocks developing. So countries form blocks together in order to have more influence and to shape the rules. Now, in terms of economics, what are the challenges of the economic order? So there are two challenges, of course. So what are the rules necessary to ensure the functioning of the system? And what can you do such that the rules still reflect some national preferences and identity? So there's recent work by Grossman and Helpman focusing very much on identity issues. So that's still, and I think Dani will talk at length about this too. So different areas of the economic orders is intellectual property rights, patents, competition, health, GMOs, quarantine chicken comes to mind, and environmental and social standards. And of course, also privacy rules. And the other big challenge is how to enforce all of these rules and who is enforcing it and is it credibly enforced. Now, in terms of geopolitics and economics, there's of course a balance of power, and Larry Summers coined the famous phrase, balance of financial terror. Essentially, China is holding a lot of US treasuries and has therefore also some control over the influence of the US and vice versa. So there's a balance of power in this case. So if you have financial integration and if you have economic integration, you create some interdependency. You lose some autonomy, but you have some interdependency. You see this very clearly when Penny Goldberg was talking about global value chains. It's very, very important that there's some interdependence there. So the forces interact, of course, and there's also a convergence to common values. There's a pressure to create common human values that there will be, reflected in this setting. And there will be a flows of ideas and of people, and that makes wars more costly. Once you have global value chains, it's much more difficult, much more costly to go start a conflict. And you have also, of course, common threats, like the current COVID crisis. Coronavirus is a common threat, and this might be also sharpen your mind to stick together, but it might also be a divisive force. But you lose, of course, diversity. You lose, to some extent, the possibility to have regional experimentation, and you might lose some identity as well. That's, Grossman and Hauptmann worked on identity, as I mentioned before, and your resiliency might depend very much whether you have a regional shock, and then actually heavy integration helps because only one region might have a shock and the other region can help out. But if you have a symmetric global shock as we have now, the resiliency might be compromised. You might feel too safe in this. Let me move on a little bit about the geopolitics and globalization and refer to some work I did with Raj Doshi and Harold James, where we looked at this, how great powers compete economically these days. And what we did actually, we compared Germany, Imperial Germany, with the UK, the rivalry which happened in the late 19th century, with the rivalry which happens now between China and the United States. And how do these great powers compete economically? And you can see that they're competing in a sense. There's one way to compete is with global infrastructure projects. So you have power projection through the infrastructure projects. And everybody's familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is here the right picture. But it's very similar to the Berlin-Baghdad railway. And if you go to Istanbul, you see still the train station of the big railway, which was planned to run from Berlin all the way to Baghdad. So the analogies are just striking between what happened in the late 19th century Germany and what China is doing now. You can also have a lot of what we call fighting with finance. So you have, interaction, you use your financial industry to fund some projects or gain influence abroad. And most importantly, what I would like to focus on a little bit there now is this technological standard setting. So you have essentially the ability to set the standards. If you look at when Europe was able to set the standards on the mobile phone standards on GSM, it got a competitive advantage. China tries to set the standard on the 5G network. And of course, the technological standard setting, I think, is way more important these days than looking at tariffs or other elements. And that's what we outlined there. I would like to spend 2 more slides on the technology side and go from there. The question is a little bit, do we want a flow of ideas? What's the optimal degree of openness of flow of ideas? On the one hand, if you have too open flow of ideas, you don't allow regional experimentation anymore. It's more complicated to try your own way, and you might limit natural monopolies as well. So, and that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you allow a lot of flow of ideas, you allow cross-pollination. So that's actually, somebody develops an idea in one region and you can also use it in the other region. And that's actually a good thing. In general, the size and speed matters. Having a large home market matters to a large degree. If you have a large home market, you can set the standards, especially for technology, and that gives you an edge. So smaller countries probably will associate themselves with larger countries in order to be part of a larger block in order to set the standards, which then impact new technological development and then gives you an edge in this new technology. very important is also the privacy considerations. If you think about the 5G network, there's a big debate on these issues, and that's very important when we talk about globalization as well. Now, what's about borders and blocks? I would like to make the case that we have legal borders, we have countries and blocks of countries putting together, but technology or data largely ignores national borders and creates their own borders in form of networks. What's the border of Facebook? There's no border, it has its own network. And that technology in general raises difficult issues in terms of globalization, on competition side, on privacy or preferences more generally side. And you can actually use networks, what's often referred to as weaponization of networks through surveillance, dependency, as you can use also currency, the weaponization of the dollar, as many people have talked about. So I would like to finish my introductory remarks with a short poll question. Should we use the COVID crisis to rethink all of the globalization we went through in the last few decades and also trade? Or should we go back to the status pre-crisis? So we go back what we did before, but is this a nice opportune possibility to really rethink the whole globalization, how the whole world order should look like? And I would like to get your opinion on that. And the second question is, will a granular approach motivated by health considerations ultimately kill trade like it did in the 1930s? So should we allow for that, or will it, it's a prediction question, will it kill it or not? Yes or no? So A is yes and B is no. And the third aspect is, will the implications for the emerging and developing economies, countries, will it be detrimental? As we have seen in the last few decades, of course, China and other countries benefited enormously from technological transfer, as Penny Goldberg pointed out, and that's very bad. Should be be sad about this, or is it okay? So is it very bad, or is it okay in order to eliminate inequalities within the advanced economies? And so I want to leave it with that and ask questions, and perhaps we can answer these questions briefly, and then we can I can just summarize them. Can you see the results? So the questions were, should we use COVID crisis to rethink globalization and trade more generally? 86% think we should fundamentally rethink it, and only 14% think we should go back what we had before. Okay, that's a very strong statement, I think, and that we have to then fundamentally rethink, and Dani will help us to start this thinking, or he started it a long time ago. Second question is, will this granular approach, we will drift because of these health considerations, we will kill trade ultimately, and only 22% think that's the case, and 78% think no, that's not the case. Trade will be an important component in any new world order. And finally, the third question is, will the implications for the emerging economies, will it be detrimental because technological transfer will decline, or will it be okay? And 62% think it will be detrimental, and only 38% think it will be okay. So with this, let me pass the floor to Dani, and he will give us his perspective. Thanks a lot, Dani. Can you share your screen?
Thank you. Thank you, Markus, very much for this. You've really put together a fantastic lineup of speakers, and you're to be congratulated for that. I also love the way that you begin each one of these with a mini lecture of your own, which is always interesting. I should tell you that my great-grandfather worked for the Berlin-Baghdad airway back in the Ottoman times.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I do have a personal connection to some of the earlier geopolitical competitions that you discussed. I'm going to be talking about where we're headed with globalization, and talk about my own ideas about where we could be or should be going. First, with respect to the immediate impact of COVID-19, everybody who's listening into this knows that the immediate impact on economic globalization has been very negative. We can see that in a very large reduction, or in this case, very large outflow of portfolio flows from the emerging markets in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. Much bigger outflow than we've ever seen. We also see it in current projections on what's likely to happen to the volume of world trade. The WTO projects that the volume of trade this year will decline from somewhere between 10 and 35%. And that's, again, a very, very large reversal. But as this chart actually shows, there was already a process of what we might call deglobalization that was going on well before the current pandemic, the current crisis, or in fact, well before Trump launched his trade war against China. This chart from the WTO shows the trend in the growth of trade pre-2008 and since 2008, and you can see very clearly in this chart that the trend growth rate already was significantly slower. So the first point that I really want to make is that even though the effect of the pandemic on globalization is certainly negative, I think this effect works mainly in the direction of reinforcing and retrenching and entrenching some trends that were already in place and that we can already see in the statistics. So again, returning to world trade, since the financial crisis of 2008-2009, there has been a significant decline in the buoyancy of world trade. So this, if you look at these individual little diamonds here, they are sort of the annual elasticities of world trade with respect to GDP. And typically in the post-war period, these elasticities have always been significantly above 1, meaning that when world GDP grew by 1%, world trade, the volume of world trade grew by 1.5%, 1.6%. But these elasticities have significantly come down, have hovered around 1, and in fact have fallen below 1 very, very recently. We have to remember that one of the biggest driver of the post-1990 expansion of world trade was, of course, China, with its major expansion of exports and correspondingly imports. There has been really a dramatic reduction in the export orientation of the Chinese economy. This shows that China's export to GDP ratio has fallen from somewhere around 36% to something like 20%. So that's like a 16 percentage point decline in the export to GDP ratio of China, which reflects a number of different things, including China bringing back supply chains back home. But this major driver of trade globalization is significantly slowed down. More specifically, global value chains have also, the growth of global value chains have begun to slow down as well. Perhaps the bit of this that surprised me the most when I was looking at the data is that even growth in service exports has been significantly slowing down, because services was the part of exports that have been expanding the most rapidly in recent years. But just last year, the growth of service exports was very, very anemic. And with respect to financial globalization, I think I have not actually seen data like this for the last couple of years, but the volume of cross-border capitals have actually also declined since the pre-financial crisis peak. Now, much of this is actually what's happening within the euro area, but still, we're below the pre-financial crisis peak. So all of these are suggesting that there's an ongoing process, whether you look at trade as a whole, global value chains, you look at finance, that there's an ongoing process of, rather than calling it deglobalization, I guess I would rather call it a process of a retreat from hyperglobalization. It's a term that I'll try to say a little bit more in a couple of minutes. So if we take it as a given that the COVID-19 crisis is simply going to reinforce and entrench this trend, how do we think about this? The second main argument that I want to make, in some ways, my main argument, is that a retreat from hyperglobalization is not going to be necessarily bad if we manage in the process to construct a more sensible globalization, one that's based on economically more sound principles than the one that we have had. This is by no means a foregone conclusion. We could easily end up going off the rails in a major way. And so we don't know exactly. So what I'm going to be arguing for certainly is not a prognosis. If I were to make a prognosis, I would probably say that we're more likely to go wrong, at least in the short to medium term, than go right. But I want to suggest that there is a path forward that does not entail trying to reestablish the hyper-globalist order that we've tried to build since the 1990s, that retreats in some ways, or I should say not retreats in some ways from that, but also rebuilds globalization on a more sustainable, more inclusive manner. So in the rest of my talk, what I want to do is just try to diagnose a little bit what went wrong with our hyper-globalist model that is now in retreat. I want to step back and say, okay, if we were to construct a sensible economic globalization, what kind of normative principles would we want to apply? So that's normative logic of global regimes. And that's going to lead me into discussion of what kind of globalization we should want. And then to the extent that there is time left, I want to apply those principles to what is probably the most important economic relationship of our day in terms of, playing a role in determining the future of economic globalization. That's the US-China economic relationship. And I want to say a little bit about how these broad normative principles can be rendered concrete, can be applied to the US-China relationship. So that's sort of the plan. I titled this slide "Making a Globalization" because I want to drive home the point that globalization is not something that, because of technology, because of information and communication revolution, that it's something that's totally exogenous, that just falls onto our laps, that we've had no control over. I think far from it. I think the particular type of economic globalization we've had since the 1990s is one that has been the result of conscious decisions, policy decisions that have been made by important actors, governments, and of course banks and firms pushing the government's policy decisions in particular directions. So we need to understand that globalization is not a kind of necessarily a self-generated regime, that a globalization runs on both rules, explicit rules, as well as on norms. So the policy decisions that we make here are key. Some of these rules are explicit and they're written into legislation or agreements. So we have bunch of trade and investment agreements, everything from the WTO, the rules of the WTO, to bilateral or multilateral or regional trade and investment agreements. We have the extremely important set of banking laws and regulations within financial centers, New York City and London, that sustain financial globalization. OECD membership requires rules that are sort of imposed, or that countries have to adopt in order to join and remain members of the OECD. Of course, the European Union runs on now, I think it's nearly 200,000 pages of rules and regulations called the Acquis Communautaire. All of that sort of sustains a single, common single market in Europe. So some of these are explicit, but I think others, and often much more important, are the rules that underpin globalization that are internalized through norms of good behavior. So for example, for the vast majority of emerging markets and developing countries today, the norm of openness to capital flows is not necessarily one that is enforced through international agreements. It's not something that the IMF or any investment agreement makes those countries do. It's a norm that these policymakers in those countries themselves have internalized. Similarly, I think many decisions that developed country policymakers make with respect to whether to prioritize the international trade investment regime or to prioritize domestic economic and social policy goals, those priorities are the result of certain norms about what good policy making entails, and are not things that are simply enforced on Europe or the United States by the WTO. So therefore, the question then becomes, where do these rules come from? Who writes those rules? Whose preferences, whose policy preferences are privileged? And that's the whole point about making a globalization. That globalization regime gets to be determined by these explicit choices that are being made. So to drive the point home, sometimes I make the following, which is, I think it's comparison or thought experiment that is perhaps particularly germane today in the midst of a health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, is to imagine that we had invested all our political capital and international diplomacy on building a kind of globalization that revolved around global public health, and that had elevated the World Health Organization to a kind of organization that is as central to globalization as, let's say, the IMF, the OECD, or the WTO is today when we think about globalization. Alternatively, think about a globalization that revolves around a set of rules in the environment or climate change, where at the center we have international environment agreements. You could envisage a globalization where we're concerned about social rights and the status of labor and labor rights, where the ILO, an organization that is truly peripheral to everything that happens today in the world, played as a role as strong as the one that the IMF or the WTO does. Or a globalization that privileges the economic over some of those other aspects that I've mentioned, health, environment, or human and labor rights, but an economic globalization that privileges, let's say, the priorities of developing countries. And that one would be perhaps centered around UNCTAD rather than what we have today. So we could have had very many different types of globalization, and we've picked only one. Even within economic globalization.
So Dani, can I interject here? Because there are some questions about the emerging economies and developing economies. Do you see, in terms of demographics, a difference too, that the emerging economies have a lot of young people, young population, while the advanced economies an old population? That's one question. And what can small emerging economies do that if they don't want to rely on China or the United States? Is there anything on their own? And do you see a shift from China towards India? Is India benefiting from Chinese-US tensions?
Marcus, perhaps I can come back to those questions after I've gone through a little bit more of the argument, because I think it'll be easier for me to respond in the context of the argument that I'm making. I want to exemplify the multiplicity of globalizations even within the economic domain by talking about a little bit about the history of economic globalization, and that we have had at least 3 different models of economic globalization going back to the early gold standard. So those 3 models are the gold standard, the Bretton Woods regime, and the post-1990 regime of what I called hyperglobalization. And I've differentiated these across 5 different aspirational criteria, but I could have added others as well. The first 3 have to do with which type of markets we are liberalizing. Are we liberalizing the flows of capital, the trade in goods, or labor mobility? And in those 3 respects, in fact, these 3 regimes were very different. Gold standard aspirationally was open in all 3 of those domains. Bretton Woods really only in terms of trade in goods. The post-1990 hyperglobalization added free capital mobility, but did not adopt labor mobility. With respect to the last column, the question is whether the policies and the norms, whether the regime is maintained with assistance from multilateral governance institutions. And the Bretton Woods and the post-1990 hyperglobalization did have central role being played by multilateral governance institutions. The gold standard, by contrast, was actually maintained through essentially norms internalized by policymakers themselves. That there were certain rules that countries had to do, but this was not being enforced through any kind of global multilateral institutions. Now, the one piece of this table that I really think is interesting, because it's the aspect of a globalization, of an economic globalization regime that becomes, I think, politically the most fragile and ultimately untenable, is this one on the 4th column, the question of whether the regime entails rules that significantly reach behind borders. And that's the sense in which I think hyperglobalization relates to the gold standard. It's a very, very different regime when you look at it in terms of the actual mechanics or the actual policies. But there is one important principle that connects the gold standard to today's hyperglobalization, which is that increasingly we have developed international norms, international rules that reach into domestic economic and social arrangements. In the context of the gold standard, of course, that was very famously and explicitly in the context of how the rules of the gold standard constrained the conduct of what today we would call monetary policy or macroeconomic policy. And of course, that was the famous, it was the source of the political fragility of the gold standard, the extent to which the rules prevented individual countries from employing macroeconomic policies that relaxed what today we would call austerity. There's a famous, of course, quote in U.S. political history. William Jennings Bryan, one of the leaders of the populists back in the tail end of the 19th century, uttering the famous statement that said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," a very poignant statement. That you cannot let our domestic society be essentially left hostage to the requirements of this global rules. And that was a very earlier meeting point between the globalization and the populist backlash, driven by very much the same kind of, I think, conflict we have today between the requirements of economic globalization and parts of society fighting back, essentially saying we have our own needs and we want different kinds of policies than what economic globalization requires. Okay, so if we want to sort of step back from this and think normatively about, what kind of global rules we might require, the key design question here is going to be, where do we have global rules and where do we let national autonomy be? So where do we put the dividing point between where every country can do whatever they want to do versus having global rules that's going to constrain what they can do? And that decision immediately faces what I call the central trade-off of any globalization regime, which is that common rules have the advantage of maximizing efficiency, predictability, reducing transactions costs, reaping the benefits of scale and the gains from trade. That's the advantage we get from having a common set of rules. But they have the disadvantage of, because they constrain policy autonomy, they constrain the ability of individual countries to design policies that might be more attuned to their needs. They also constrain the ability to experiment at the national level, and that experimentation might actually be globally useful too, in the sense of being able to generate new policies, new ideas that might not have been in the context of a common set of rules. So the question there, if the question is how are we going to decide what is international and what is national? Where do we have global rules constrain national policy autonomy? The first thing we might say or think is, well, where there are cross-border spillovers, when countries do things that spill over the border to other countries, then we might want to constrain what countries do. But that rule is way too expansive in a way that would actually rule out many things that we naturally think are actually desirable for countries to have reasonable full policy autonomy. So just an illustrative list, educational policies, we think that this should be in the domain of countries deciding what they do. But of course, standard trade theory will tell you that your educational policies will affect your comparative advantage and therefore will affect the trade possibilities of your other countries. So they certainly spill over. The same for your R&D policies. Your highway speed limits would affect the demand for oil, and it affects the world price of oil, and therefore obviously spills over. Similarly with gasoline taxes. So these kinds of things that we naturally, almost instinctively believe should be domains of national policy would be constrained through international agreement if we simply apply the principle that whenever there are cross-border spillovers, we should try to negotiate some kind of an international regime. But sort of our instinct tells us that that can't possibly be right. And I think that's right, that neither the presence nor I think the magnitude of cross-border spillovers are in fact a sufficient conditions for the creation of global rules, even when they impose harm on foreign countries, because there are very compelling reasons, as in these specific policy domains for national diversity, and because of the way that political accountability is still organized on the basis of nation states today. So the principle of spillovers, cross-border spillover, actually does not help us very much. I would like to suggest that there are in fact two canonical arguments that create a rationale for global rules, and I'll call them by their sort of technical names in economics. One is beggar thy neighbor policies, and the other are global public goods. Now, I think it's useful to think of these in their sort of technical term in economics, because they mean something very clear, and because they mean something very clear, they help us demarcate areas where there are very strong arguments for global rules or global regimes, and where the arguments are in fact rather weaker. So it's important to understand what BTN and GPGs are. Beggar thy neighbor policies are policies that provide benefits at home only to the extent that they impose a cost on foreign countries. So it's not just the spillover, it's just that the home country derives a benefit directly as a consequence of the cost that is imposed on other countries. So archetypal example of this is the use of monopoly power in international markets. So some years back, China restricted exports of rare earth minerals because it has near monopoly in these rare earth minerals, which are used in cell phones and other advanced technology areas. And quite clearly, the point was to raise world prices. And that was a clear example of a beggar thy neighbor policy. Another example might be when there is generalized unemployment, trying to export unemployment through currency manipulation. In fact, the term beggar thy neighbor came into economic circulation when Joan Robinson in the 1930s used it to refer to currency depreciation policies on the part of individual countries, which was in this context. I actually don't think in the gold standard context this was truly a beggar thy neighbor policy, but that was the origin. Another important area where I think there's a beggar thy neighbor is when countries establish tax havens not for the purpose of attracting physical foreign investment, but simply by shift corporate headquarters to shift paper profits. And that's another example of a clear-cut beggar thy neighbor. Now, global public goods are areas where there is, essentially where there's very strong incentive to free ride on other nations' policies. Climate change is the classic case. We all share one climate. It doesn't matter where the greenhouse gases are emitted. And purely from a self-interest standpoint, it wouldn't make sense for any individual country to control greenhouse gas emissions because these emissions essentially become what matters is the collective, is the global emissions. From a much more germane to our current day, there are many elements of global public goods in public health. For example, vaccine development, which I know Michael Kramer was talking about last week, is a clear area of a global public good. Once a vaccine is discovered, then essentially everybody can utilize it. Now, so these are very clear-cut cases where you might make a normative argument for for establishing a global regimes. The point with respect to economics and economic globalization is that, in fact, in most areas of economics, it's very hard to think that either one of these two arguments apply, either the beggar thy neighbor or the global public good, that there is a very limited case for global rules within most economic domains. And the reason for that, to use sort of very colloquial language, is that in most economic policy, virtue, that is, virtue is its own reward. That is to say, most of the things we would like countries to do that are actually good from a global standpoint are also things that are actually good for them to do for their own. That's what I mean by virtue being its own reward. So, for example, in terms of free trade, policies towards openness to trade, that, when we teach, comparative advantage and the gains from trade, the argument for free trade is not that you should liberalize so that you provide benefits to other countries. The argument is that you should liberalize because it expands consumption possibilities for your own domestic economy. So it's good for you. And I think the same goes for for most of the important areas of economic policy. So openness to foreign capital. If that's good to the extent that is actually good for your own economy. Pursuing policies of financial regulation and macroeconomic stability, the primary beneficiary, once again, is your domestic economy. Now, that is not to say that there aren't areas where, in fact, there are exceptions. But most of the important exceptions happen to be the ones I've already mentioned, that under the heading of beggar thy neighbor. So monopoly power in world trade, currency mercantilism, or global tax havens are the three most important areas of beggar thy neighbor that I can think of. Now, this doesn't mean that countries actually don't make mistakes, that they don't, employ policies that are, that financial regulation, macroeconomic stability, policies towards capital flows, or policies toward trade that are misguided from their own domestic standpoint. But there should be no presumption in general that when countries do things that are the wrong policies from their own domestic standpoint, that international rules can reliably prevent such mistakes. And I think when we look at often what international rules do, they're just as likely to privilege one set of distributive interests within nation states over others, as they are to really target genuine areas of governance failure. So there could be an argument for delegation, for example, when there is domestic policy subject to time inconsistency or other types of policies where some international constraint, a trade agreement, can prevent domestic policy failure. But there are often as many other cases where, in fact, either, for example, banks that are able to dominate the agenda of capital rules in context of BIS, or multinationals or big pharma that are able to shape the agenda of international trade negotiations. What is really being done is one set of domestic interests being privileged over others. Markus, I see that you're trying to get in, so let me.
So if it's okay, is it a good time now to ask some questions?
Yeah.
I just want to get a sharper dividing line between beggar than neighbor and externalities. Do I see it correctly that if I want to do something because I have a certain preference and I cause some externality on somebody else, that's okay. But if I do something which gives me a financial benefit, that's a beggar than neighbor. Just, is this the dividing line?
No, I think the dividing line is for you to think about whether it's something that you might want to do regardless of the repercussions on other countries. So if you want, if you're, let's say, a major financial center, and you're really totally mismanaging your regulatory policies, this would be just, it's not a beggar thy neighbor policy because you're pursuing policies. These are, even if you're the only country in the world, you'll still be doing the same thing. So I think that's the dividing line between beggar thy neighbor. Beggar thy neighbor policies are going to be, typically, negative sum. Now, the problem with policies that are not beggar thy neighbor, but are potentially damaging at home, is that a third-party observer cannot necessarily always judge whether that policy was inappropriate or not from the perspective of the home country, because after all, that home country has decided this policy. A good example of this is European agricultural subsidies. Okay. European agricultural subsidies are not beggar thy neighbor, they're enrich thy neighbor, because to the extent that Europe is an exporter of these subsidized agricultural products, it's providing a net benefit to the rest of the world.
But some people argue it destroys the agriculture development in the emerging economies to some extent.
It could be a harm to some specific groups, but that is no different than if you are liberalizing your own trade, and therefore you become a much better competitor vis-a-vis, let's say, so you liberalize your trade, your exports go up by Lerner symmetry. And therefore, countries that have a similar comparative advantage to you will now suffer at terms of trade loss, right? So now you've made some producers in the rest of the world worse off by your own liberalization, but we would never say that you should not liberalize your home just because there are some segment of the rest of the world that has become worse off. So I think the same logic applies to agricultural subsidies, is that, you know, in aggregate, the rest of the world is better off. There might be some that are worse off. The question is whether the rest of the world has any claim to tell Europe that you're pursuing the wrong policy when Europe, through its own democratic, you know, decision-making mechanisms, have arrived at, you know, a policy that most of us economists think are crazy, but, you know, that it's their own, but they're harming their own consumers and taxpayers. If that is the wrong thing, they're mostly harming their own consumers and taxpayers in the first place. So I think in the case of a policy like agricultural subsidy, there's a very weak argument for a global restriction on Europe's ability to harm itself, because there might be compensating social or other arguments for why there is an economically costly policy being pursued. And we should let European governments in their, you know, with their democratic accountability decide that. When there's a beggar thy neighbor, you can sort of, you know, genuinely turn to that government and say, look, but the only benefit you could potentially be getting from this policy is through the harm you're imposing on us. And that's the claim why it would, you know, why the claim for a global rule makes, I think, normative sense. So I'm going to try to make this a little bit more concrete by saying that if you take these normative building blocks seriously, then you know, then the dividing line between what's global and what's national essentially should be determined by your answers to these three questions. So you want, say, kind of globalization that, number one, has the potential to produce overall benefits. And the larger the aggregate gains from trade, the greater the possibilities of domestic redistribution, therefore compensating those who might lose. So number one is you want to focus on areas where the gains from trade are very large. So for example, that might suggest that when the world trade regime is already very open, when the world financial capital flows regime are very open, the net gains are actually very small. The potential for compensating the losers are rather small. But like in labor mobility, where the gains from trade are huge because the barriers are so high, that in fact would be a priority relative to working on improving, reducing transactions costs with respect to trade in goods and financial services. Now, the second principle is precisely follows up on what I've been discussing, which is that there's a very strong argument to focus on areas where there are bigger than neighbor and global public goods. But third, otherwise, would actually leave space for policy autonomy and institutional diversity. So in other areas, you'd essentially leave countries to pursue their own policies. And I think my claim would be, in terms of the big answer, if finally getting sort of, is where did we go wrong after the 1990s? I think from the perspective of these desiderata, I think our priorities since 1990s have been significantly off. If you look at sort of where we have focused, that's clear from what I've said. So
can you give us some examples here, like the chlorine chicken or GMO? Would you say that?
Well, the GMO is another example where I would say it's not a beggar thy neighbor. So the GMO, European limits on GMO, again, Europe would have these restrictions regardless of whether it was, there were other countries in the world. They've decided to apply a principle that is way too, from most, sort of scientists' perspective, are too restrictive, because we don't have any evidence that GMOs might be harmful. A very restrictive precautionary principle says that we should still have, Europe. That's what the Europeans have decided. If there's a harm that's involved, it's mostly to their own consumers, and therefore I would say it's not for the rest of the world to tell the Europeans that they should not be hurting themselves to the extent that they are. The same would apply to European restrictions on hormone-fed beef, for example, is a very similar kind of area.
What's about patent protection? How does this fit in?
Well, that's another case where I think the bulk of those issues have to do with countries choosing policy regimes that might differ from the advanced countries because they believe that they're at a level of development where the balance of costs and benefits suggests a much more lax intellectual property rights regime, to the extent that they lose out on foreign investment because they have weaker intellectual property regimes. Once again, it's the loss is domestic. But yet, we have essentially converted that in the trade vernacular into a kind of a more realistic, stealing intellectual property rights or a beggar thy neighbor kind of an issue, when it's not, when in fact it's not. So intellectual property rights is an area where I would leave countries a very wide degree of latitude and that in fact I don't think really belongs in international trade rules. So I think in the international economic arena where I think where we could have done more are things like global tax havens, because these are, many of them are take the beggar thy neighbor color. We could have done more, although it's politically difficult, but if you can be precise in the area of labor, precisely because the possibility of domestic compensation is much bigger, given the magnitude of the gains from trade there. That possibly is an area where we might have done. So there are some areas we could have tried to push globalization further. There are some areas where I think we've gone too far in the wrong direction. I think the main area of global public goods are again, sort of global public health pandemics, climate change. Those are really the big, possibly international human rights, where the global norm of human rights. Those are areas, largely non-economic areas, where we could have invested a lot more from this normative criteria. So maybe, for 5 minutes, how am I doing? Do I have 5 more minutes?
Yes, we can go a little bit longer.
Just take these ideas and try to apply them more concretely, for example, or think about how they might be applied to the logic of the US-China economic conflict. Just recently, a few months ago, we convened a group of economists and legal scholars from the United States and China. The group was co-led by Jeff Lehman, Yang Yao, and myself, and I've managed to misspell my name, which is quite good. And then we put together a report which was called U.S.-China Trade Relations: A Way Forward. This was from October, and we had actually a fairly good and high-level sort of list of signatories, including 5 Nobel Prize winners in economics who signed on to this. And the idea was that we wanted to, I think right now, as everybody knows, the discussion on China is essentially vacillates between two positions, which I think neither are tenable. One of them is sort of going back to this, deep integration agenda, the hyper-globalization agenda. And I think membership of China in the WTO was essentially implicitly presumed that China was going to become just another member of the WTO with kind of an economic regime that would increasingly converge to that sort of a Western idea of a market economy. Now, it's become clear that that's not where the Chinese economy is going. And now there's increasingly another position, especially in Washington, which is called sort of the decoupling position, which is essentially a much more dramatic decoupling of the economies of US and China, because China is an economy that's run on obviously such different principles. Now that the decoupling position has a lot of political, geopolitical layerings as well. But what we want to do is come up with a position that is somewhere in between those, a position that can preserve the bulk of the gains from trade, while also allowing the two countries sort of reasonable amounts of policy autonomy. That would mean in some ways pushing back from the idea that by signing on to the WTO, China had essentially accepted to run its own economy in a particular way, and also pushing back from the notion that the United States had to leave its market open to Chinese exports and Chinese investment, no matter what that did to US labor markets or to the innovation system or the integrity of technologies in the United States. Okay? So we want to do what is prioritize policy space for both countries, allow these two countries considerable latitude at home to design a wide variety of industrial policies in China, or innovation systems and social standards, labor market policies. But also draw very clear red lines around policies that might be beggar thy neighbor policies. Okay? So for that purposes, the approach that we came up with essentially has 4 buckets. So the idea would be that China, the Chinese and US negotiators would carry out their discussions around around these 4 buckets and try to put their policy disagreements in different domains, try to put them into one of these 4 different buckets. So the bucket 1 is one where there is clearly countries would be prohibited from engaging in such activities, and those would be very specifically these beggar thy neighbor policies. So if one country imposes restrictions on trade with the express purpose of reaping monopoly pricing gains on world markets, or engages in discriminatory data policies that promote predatory pricing or rent extraction from other countries' firms, so those are clear examples of beggar thy neighbor policies in this domain. If a policy is not a beggar thy neighbor policy, then the second step in some ways is to see whether it might fit into bucket 2, which is the bucket where there are spillovers and externalities, and potentially there might be ways of reaching an agreement if the cost of this spillover externality to one country is much bigger than the gain that the origin country is reaping. So you might be able to figure out some way of compensation, some way of reining in what one country is doing by providing maybe benefits somewhere else. What I think is the critical part of this approach is the third bucket, which is called the domestic adjustment bucket, is where this is not a beggar thy neighbor policy, and you cannot reach a mutual agreement. So neither bucket 1 nor bucket 2 works. So a mutually beneficial bargain cannot be negotiated. In this case, then essentially the country that has a policy that provides a negative spillovers can keep its policies, and country B is then allowed to undertake what we call sort of well-calibrated domestic policy adjustments with the demonstrable aim of reducing the harm that those country A's policies impose on its own domestic economy. Okay. The key, however, is that the remedy that country B would employ to protect its own economy must be proportionate and well targeted at the domestic objective. So it's not actually using a threat against country A to get country A to change its policies, or it's not trying to raise the stakes in a kind of a trade war. So it's purely trying to protect its own economic policies or social arrangements, rather than trying to get to change the other country's policies. So I think this would be, sort of in principle, of course, the question is if such principles were adopted, the big discussion would be whether policies belong in which one of these buckets the policies would belong in. But I think this provides a kind of a useful language for organizing our thinking about where things where certain policies should be subject to international surveillance, others less so, what kind of bargains different countries can strike. And I think the way that we thought about this is the principles could apply multilaterally as well. There's no reason why you can't apply these same principles in a multilaterally. But obviously the US-China relationship is in some sense the most fractious and the most contentious one. In some sense, it provides the biggest test to these kinds of ideas. So let me just stop here and see if there are some.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Dani. It was really a nice presentation and a nice way to think about globalization. I want to interject the question by Jean Grossman put forward a question. Let me just read it to you. Why isn't cooperation always better than non-cooperation, regardless where the property rights lie? And don't we want countries to take into account the spillovers on others, even if the country has some moral or legal right to behave as it wishes? So I think you have a very practical, the buckets approach, but what's about if you come with a more cooperative spirit to it?
Yeah, thanks, Jean. Jean, by the way, is a signatory to.
Yes,
I hope his name is included here. Yes, it is.
Yes.
So he's a signatory, and I think what you're talking about, Jean, in the context of like the U.S.-China trade would be essentially bucket two. So you would think that in a lot of areas where if it is very in this strictly a kind of an externality, and the reason I don't use the externality is because I use the term spillover. It's a broader thing. If it's strictly an externality, it is the case, of course. Then regardless of where you allocate the property rights, and there's always a kind of a should be a mutually acceptable bargain that you can work out. But first, a lot of these issues aren't strictly speaking externalities, and I think and then sort of many of these areas, such as the use of industrial policy by China, or the use of certain restrictive technology policies in the case of the United States, is going to be, as a practical matter, it's going to be very difficult for one country to agree to essentially compensate the externality or the spillover producing countries to not employ these policies through either through transfers or by finding other policies on which it can provide some kind of compensating benefit to the trade partner. But the point of bucket two is if you can reach such an arrangement, by all means do so. So always cooperate. And there's always one area where cooperation, I think, always dominates is you can always talk, because I think talking in terms of explaining to your partners why you're pursuing some policies, that's always helpful. So you can actually find out what the preferences of your trade partners are. So cooperation in terms of talking, information exchange, and finding why different countries are pursuing different policies, that always is helpful. The question becomes, once you have that information and to the extent that you can, why certain countries are pursuing policies that are different, they don't fall into a strictly a better thy neighbor category. Is it still going to be possible to work out an arrangement along the lines of bucket two? And I think, the evidence is that often no, but to the extent that that is possible, obviously it's going to be better.
I just wanted to know who decides which bucket are we in, because it affects the bargaining power then dramatically. Is there a higher organization to decide, or this is a beggar than neighbor violation, or is not, or?
So as in everything international, so this is an area where you need to develop the norms you don't presume that parties come to the bargaining table with full trust and full shared norms, but you hope that if you have a reasonable way of moving forward, that that trust and shared norms can develop over time. So the question for the starting point is, are there a set of principles which both sides can agree on as a way of talking? And I think part of the appeal of using a term like beggar thy neighbor, which is a precise technical content, is that it also disciplines the parties from not abusing it. So if one of the parties explicitly employs a beggar thy neighbor policy, but then says in the negotiations, it's not a beggar thy neighbor policy, then there is a certain amount of opprobrium that would have, would attach to it on the part of third parties, observers, economists, so there are some limits to how much you can stretch the rules. But ultimately it has to be, so this has got to be self-enforcing. And the only way it can be self-enforcing, as in everything in trade, is that you develop these sort of shared norms over time, and you build the trust over time because it's in the interest of both parties.
Thanks a lot, Dani. Just perhaps we can conclude with some questions which was primarily about populism and nationalism. Do you think that reaching behind the borders was a major contributor to this nationalism and populism movement, yellow vests and other aspects? And using the your bucket approach would actually prevent this, or would have slow down the nationalism movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we now have since it's work that David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hansen started, and now we have very similar papers also from Europe as well that shows that this period of significant export expansion from China, the Chinese export boom, is at least partly responsible for support for right-wing authoritarian and right-wing populist movements, whether it's sort of Trump in the United States, the Brexit vote in the UK, or support for right-wing nationalist populist movements in continental Europe. And so this is interesting because it could have been avoided if the governments had taken a kind of a perhaps either slow down somewhat providing access to Chinese exports into the US market or the European markets. Or they had engaged in certain much more extensive sort of safeguard action. It's useful and yet they didn't, because the idea was that, well, we're in this area where you better adjust to the trade. Trade is such a good thing that even if your local labor markets in certain regions are being ravaged, you just don't do anything. Free trade is such a amazing good thing that it's more important. And that's a kind of this was a norm that developed after the 1990s that didn't necessarily exist. You go back one decade earlier to the 1980s, and you're the president of the United States, Reagan, right, a conservative Republican. And then it was really Japan that was really the export superhouse. And in the 1980s, we had a very different approach because Reagan started with all these trade restrictions, voluntary export restrictions on exports from Japan in steel, in cars, also the Europeans. So there was a very ad hoc series of trade restrictions that were imposed by a conservative Republican president in the United States to limit the impact of trade on labor markets and social bargains in the United States. You go back, a decade before then, you have the multi-fiber arrangement, which again, when the developing countries started to export clothing and garments in a very big way, those countries, European countries, essentially worked out, US and European countries worked out this bargain with developing country exporters that would limit this export boom and partly also provide quota rents in compensation to the exporting countries. But it was a very different set of norms that, you don't, I mean, people, economists talked about new protectionism and so forth in the 70s and 80s, but that kind of protectionism actually saved the system because, it did not, sort of disrupt labor markets to the same extent that the Chinese export push did. In the 1990s, you didn't do that anymore. In fact, the WTO made VERs explicitly illegal and so forth. So I think, this, what I talked at the beginning of my talk about sort of norms about what you do and what you privileged, I think, this is a very different type of globalization after the 1990s, that it became no longer feasible to engage in these ad hoc arrangements, which were economically inefficient, but from a social and political standpoint, might actually have made sense.
Thanks a lot, Dani. We ran over today quite a bit, and I hope it's okay with your further commitments, but it was a fascinating talk. We're very happy to have you on this webinar series. And we're looking forward to your further thoughts on this, given that 86% think we should rethink the global trade system. And I think you will be a major player and a thinker in this space. So thanks again, and I hope to see everybody on Friday when Daron Acemoglu is talking, the same time, Friday, 12:30 US Eastern Time, or 6:30 p.m. in European time. Thanks to everybody, and see you on Friday. Bye-bye. Thanks, Dani.
Thank you, Markus.